Oh yeah, the movies. Are we having fun?
Yeah, I know.
Okay, I'm ready.
Good.
I first learned about depleted uranium when I went to Japan in the year 2000. I was invited to be a plenary speaker at the Atomic and Hydrogen Bomb Conference, which is held every year in August. And people visit Hiroshima for a very beautiful peace ceremony commemorating the people who died and who were injured in the Hiroshima bombing in World War II. And then 3 days later, everyone goes to Nagasaki, and the ceremonies held there for the victims of the Nagasaki atomic bomb. I've worked in 2 nuclear weapons laboratories, and I knew nothing about nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapons laboratory is completely secret. And in those peace museums, which are in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I learned the terrible truth about nuclear weapons. It was a really horrifying reality. And it was because of those 2 experiences that I decided, while I was in Japan, to spend the rest of my life working on radiation issues. And because I have a background in the geosciences, and my specialty is atmospheric dust, it's a very, very good background to understand how radiation cycles and recycles through the environment and how it is introduced into our bodies. And in Hiroshima, I met Akira Tashiro, a Japanese journalist who works for the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper in Hiroshima, which is very famous for writing stories about radiation. And also the journalists there have published a number of books not only about radiation survivors, they call them hibakusha, but also not just the radiation survivors in Japan, but survivors from other exposures and bomb testing in other parts of the world, like the Marshall Islands, Tahiti, Kazakhstan, where the Russians did atmospheric testing, and even the French did nuclear bomb testing in the southern Sahara Desert in North Africa. It's called the Sahel. And the Chinese did their bomb testing in the Gobi Desert. So what is depleted uranium? I had no idea until I met Akira Tashiro in Hiroshima. And he had written a series of 50 interviews with all of the stakeholders involved in the depleted uranium issue. And that was the beginning of my awareness, and then I began doing research as soon as I came back on radiation issues. Akira Tashiro asked me to write the foreword to his book, Discounted Casualties. And this is what I wrote. Which is worse, flash annihilation by nuclear explosions or slow mutilation from low-level radiation, the result of radioactive contamination of the air, water, and earth essential to life, because depleted uranium is nuclear war. Globally, we have been deceived about the health effects of radiation by bureaucratized governments informed by the military-industrial complex and scientific power. In the past half-century, 1.3 billion people have been killed, maimed, and diseased by nuclear weapons and nuclear power. Millions more will be killed, maimed, and diseased unless the citizens of the world, that's you and me and everyone doing whatever they can, demand an end to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, nuclear power, nuclear waste, and the new radiological weapons, depleted uranium. We're pulling the rope of our own death knell. And we have to thank the soldiers for their patriotic duty serving their country. But in fact, these soldiers, our sons and our daughters, are knowingly being sent off to the radioactive battlefields, and they are being turned into uranium meat. Depleted uranium is a death sentence. There's no way to stop it, there's no way to clean it up, and there's no way to turn it off. The half-life of depleted uranium is 4.5 billion years, the age of the Earth. And it takes 10 half-lives for radiation to diminish to an insignificant amount. That's 45 billion years. We will be recycled stardust by then. So, how did the idea of depleted uranium originate, and who in the world would ever dream up such a mad plan to make weapons out of uranium? Everyone knows uranium is very dangerous. In fact, during World War II, there were plans not only to make the atomic bombs, but also to make a defoliant like Agent Orange that could be used to kill the vegetation in a country and cause starvation to the civilian population. And the plan for depleted uranium weapons, which actually are poison gas weapons, radioactive poison gas weapons, was also proposed, in addition to the atomic bombs. However, the scientific power and decision makers under the Manhattan Project decided that the Agent Orange type of weapon and the depleted uranium weapons were too horrific to use on civilian populations. However, they thought the atomic bombs were acceptable. That's quite incredible. But I guess in a war, the gloves are off, and people do pretty crazy things. The problem with radiation is that it's a boomerang weapon. And so once you release it into the environment, it may go drifting off that way, but pretty soon, a week or two later, it goes around the planet and it's back in your backyard, and you're inhaling it, and babies are being exposed to it, and the unborn fetus is being exposed to it, and it has done a terrible, terrible, terrible tragedy on our planet to global public health and the health of the environment. The first blueprint for depleted uranium weapons is a memo to General Leslie Groves from the S1 Poison Gas Committee under the Manhattan Project. And this was a committee chaired by James Conant, who had designed poison gas weapons in World War I. Now, in 1925, the Geneva Convention passed the Poison Gas Protocol, which prohibited poison gas weapons because they're indiscriminate. They kill civilians, they drift off of the battlefield, they continue to act after the battle is over, so they violate international law. Despite that, the proposal was, under the Manhattan Project in 1943, to use the radioactive trash from the atomic bomb project and make dirty bombs, dirty missiles, and dirty bullets. And depleted uranium, which is a metal, can be used as warheads in bombs and missiles, and also in projectiles like bullets and larger caliber munitions, such as the munitions used in Abrams tanks. So this was the plan. They were fully aware it was a radioactive poison gas weapon, and they proposed it for use on the battlefield despite the illegal nature of the weaponry. Fortunately, they never used it. Unfortunately, they did use atomic bombs. However, in 1943, when they proposed using depleted uranium weapons, they didn't know if the atomic bombs would work. In fact, they didn't know until 1945, when they did the Trinity test at Los Alamos, that the atomic bombs would actually work, and they immediately sent little boy, the uranium bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, and Fat Man, the plutonium bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. They sent them by fast boats out into the Pacific, and they were assembled on the islands out there, and then dropped on the civilian populations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the fallout map from the nuclear weapons testing, which the United States did at the Nevada test site. And this nuclear weapons program was developed after World War II because the United States government wanted a nuclear weapons program, since the bombs had worked so well on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the result of this fallout, which is primarily depleted uranium, because the bombs have a very small plutonium core, and the bulk of the bomb is tamping made from depleted uranium to reflect the fast neutrons back into the plutonium core and make the fissioning process or the explosion more efficient. And so it's been very under-recognized, in fact quite hidden, that most of bomb testing fallout, which polluted the entire global atmosphere, is actually depleted uranium. And as a result of all of this bomb testing fallout, we have an epidemic, a global epidemic, of cancer, diabetes, obesity, chronic fatigue syndrome, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease, Hodgkin's disease. Many, many diseases are related to radiation exposure. And cancer is really just the tip of the iceberg. And the greatest impact, of course, is on the unborn babies and on newborns. They are extremely sensitive to radiation poisoning, and we had huge increases in infant mortality and also fetal death. A second exposure after the fallout, when the U.S. stopped testing bombs in 1963, Russia and the United States signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty and ended atmospheric testing. But what replaced the fallout from atomic bomb testing was nuclear power plants. And you can see in this map that 2/3 of all breast cancer deaths occurred in the United States in these dark counties. And this is a direct correlation to nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons laboratories. And you can see Los Alamos, the Idaho Nuclear Engineering Lab, Hanford, and Livermore in the San Francisco Bay Area have caused 2/3 of all breast cancer deaths, along with the nuclear power plants, particularly on the East Coast in the United States, between 1985 and 1989. And all of this data that I'm showing is from U.S. government documents and databases. So, what does the U.S. government know about depleted uranium? This is the question I had to answer for the International Criminal Tribunal for Afghanistan, which Japanese citizens organized. It was a series of 18 public hearings and 3 war crimes tribunals in 2003. And it was a very, very incredible experience. I'll never forget it. So when I began to answer one of the questions that the lawyers sent me, what does the U.S. government know about DU? Well, my answer was 12 pages long. And it was very clear that the U.S. government has known from the very beginning, from 1943. And in addition, almost every branch of the government has had some kind of warnings or exposure standards or precautionary statements, whatever, about depleted uranium. It's a very, very deadly weapon. So why is depleted uranium illegal under all treaties, agreements, war conventions, the Geneva and Hague Conventions, and U.S. Federal Code? Under U.S. Federal Code, it meets the definition of a weapon of mass destruction in 2 out of 3 categories. It also violates U.S. military law because the United States is a signatory to the Geneva and Hague Conventions. So what this means is that it's been a cover-up since it was first used in 1991 in Iraq. And the U.S. military continued using it in Yugoslavia and in Afghanistan and again in Iraq in 2003. And what we've done, the U.S. and Britain together and some of the NATO countries, is to bomb these countries and these regions into complete radioactive rubble. In fact, these regions are uninhabitable now. They are poisoned and contaminated with radiation forever. So how does depleted uranium travel and how is it transported around the world? It's quite unbelievable, but giant dust storms, even 1 million square miles in area, transport millions of tons, hundreds of thousands of tons, millions of tons of sand and dust around the world every year. And the 3 regions where they originate are North Africa, which is contaminated with French nuclear weapons testing, the sands and the dust. And also Chernobyl was fallout is contaminating the Sahara. And these North African dust storms travel across the Atlantic Ocean and they slam into the Caribbean area where there's very high rainfall. And so much of the sand and dust with these radioactive hitchhikers is deposited in the environment in the Caribbean and the Gulf states, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. These dust storms also travel north across the Mediterranean to Europe. And these are also rained out and snowed out throughout Europe and in the Alps. The radiation contaminates the rivers, the snow, and then when it melts, it transports the radiation into regions of Europe. And then it can even go to Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Lapland, all the way up towards the Arctic. So these sand and dust storms carrying all of this radiation also travel east towards Central Asia, and they contaminate Asia, the Chinese coast, and Japan. They travel up around the Pacific and contaminate Alaska, and then they come down the Pacific coast. It's impossible to escape exposure, because in 1 year this radiation is globally mixed because of global mixing and the circulation patterns of the atmosphere. Now, what is very, very dangerous about depleted uranium, and the reason it's so different and much more of a hazard than atmospheric testing fallout, is because it forms on the battlefield from, they're using it to do grid bombing and carpet bombing in these countries, and the radioactive particles, which are extremely tiny, they're nanoparticle sized, which is a tenth of a micron and smaller. They're smaller than bacteria or viruses. And so they stay suspended in the atmosphere. They're actually not pure uranium metal. They burn at very high temperatures as soon as the bullets come out of the gun barrels, and they burn at temperatures up to 3,000 degrees centigrade or even hotter, and they just completely vaporize. And then they recondense into little round, hollow balls of uranium oxides, and the density is less than 1. The density of uranium metal is over 19. So these stay suspended in the atmosphere, and the result is that they also contaminate the oceans, and they're rained out in the oceans. Our oceans are dying. Our fisheries are dying. Our corals are dying all around the world. And so are we. Where's the scientific evidence to show that this radioactive pollution is being transported all over the world? I have said this for a long time because my research was on atmospheric dust, and I had to understand how it circulates around the earth and where it's deposited. The sand and dust storms also come out of the Gobi Desert, and they travel over Japan and cross the Pacific Ocean, and they impact the west coast of North America, and they keep traveling across the United States. Another dust region where these huge storms originate is the western United States. And that, of course, is where the United States tested 1,200 nuclear weapons. They polluted horribly the whole country, all of North America, including Canada and Alaska. In March of 2006, a study was published, a scientific study by Dr. Chris Busby, who is a low-level radiation expert in Britain. And he is also on European Parliament and British government committees, official committees on low-level radiation. And what he did was a Freedom of Information Act request from the Atomic Weapons Establishment Facility at Aldermaston in Berkshire, England. And even though they are required by law to release their air monitoring data to Dr. Busby, they refused to. And when the British Freedom of Information Act law went into effect, he immediately filed a FOIA to get this data from Aldermaston. And after a very long time and a struggle, he did finally get it. And it was truly alarming. However, he told me that the data for the 2003 Iraq War was missing. And I said, well, Chris, why was that missing? And he said, oh, well, Halliburton took over that air monitoring facility from the British government in 2003. And so I began to investigate why Halliburton would take that over. And of course, when he got the data finally from another agency in the British government, the reason Halliburton had refused to release it was very clear. It was the highest levels of radiation ever measured in British air of depleted uranium. And it was also very high for the period of bombing in Afghanistan in 2001, the Tora Bora bombing. So what he was able to determine is that within 7 to 9 days of these radioactive munitions being used on the battlefield, this radioactive dust has traveled thousands of miles and contaminated the British atmosphere. In fact, Dr. Busby sat down and calculated actually how many particles of depleted uranium a average man would inhale in 2 weeks who lived within a certain radius of the facility. And he came up with the astounding number of 27 million particles inhaled in a 2-week period. Now, obviously, this depleted uranium nuclear war has been going on since 1991. And that means that people around the world have been exposed to very, very high levels for prolonged periods of this depleted uranium dust. And of course, the British government said, oh, no, 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 that uranium came out of our nuclear power plants, or it came from natural uranium in Iraq or Afghanistan. Well, that's all baloney, because the sand and the dust from the region where the depleted uranium originated was also in the air filters at Aldermaston. And there's just no doubt whatsoever where this depleted uranium dust came from. I began to investigate, well, who's benefiting from the use of this huge amounts of depleted uranium, and whose uranium is it to begin with? And what I discovered is that the British royal family, the Queen of England, has a very, very substantial interest, privately owns billions of dollars of uranium holdings through Rio Tinto mines. And this is a book called Tiny Roland, The Ugly Face of Neo-Colonialism in Africa. And this book exposes Tiny Roland, who was actually a German Nazi in the German Nazi Youth Corps in World War II. And he changed his name, and he was actually a convicted criminal at that time in Germany. And he relocated to Britain. And he became the largest businessman in Africa, Western businessman in Africa, and he established in the late 1950s Rio Tinto mines for the Queen of England. And it is through Rio Tinto mines that the Queen of England owns so much uranium holdings in mines in Africa, in Canada, and Australia. Of course, these are all former British colonies. So I wrote an article called The Queen's Death Star, and I used a poster of Queen Elizabeth on a British postage stamp that an artist made, and he did this in protest of the 2003 Iraq War. And he took that postage stamp and made it into a huge poster with the Queen wearing a gas mask. And this created quite a political flap in Britain. The Queen Buckingham Palace and the Royal Post Office objected to the poster and threatened to sue him. And he said, oh, go ahead, I'll sell more posters. And So they quietly withdrew their threats. This depleted uranium has traveled all around the world. And what we're seeing since 1991, when it was introduced to the battlefield by the U.S., is increases in infant mortality globally, which have been reported in the New York Times and the Lancet Medical Journal in Britain and in British newspapers, as well as other countries. Now, infant mortality has been declining since 1963, when the U.S. and Russia signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. So if infant mortality suddenly began increasing after 1991, then there has to be a new source of radiation, and it has to be an environmental exposure because it's happening all over the world. The problem with depleted uranium is that it is contaminating the troposphere, which is the first 10,000 feet of the atmosphere from the ground. And this is the most dynamic and the highest energy environment or part of the atmosphere, because it's where there are storms and hurricanes and big convection cells and tornadoes. It's very, very dynamic, and so the mixing occurs very quickly, and it's also transported around the world very quickly in just a matter of a couple of weeks. It's actually contaminating the whole global atmosphere, and this increase in infant mortality is like the canary in the coal mine. It's telling us we have a global environmental problem. Other diseases that it is causing are birth defects in the children of the soldiers who come back and their bodies are contaminated with depleted uranium. It's in their semen. They internally contaminate their wives and partners. And then, of course, even if the soldiers had normal babies before they went off to war, they come back, and the children, the newborns, the babies born after the exposure, have very severe birth defects. In the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Yugoslavia, mothers now in the hospital don't ask, is it a girl or a boy when their baby is born? They ask instead, is it normal? Other very large increases that we are seeing as a result of this global radiation poisoning is an epidemic of melanoma, that's skin cancer, particularly in children. I believe that diabetes is the most astounding response to the internal depleted uranium exposure, which people around the world, in fact all living things, are being exposed to. And this came to my attention when I was interviewing people who just American citizens who had gone to Iraq in 2003 during and after the Iraq War. And I was quite interested to talk to the wives, for instance, of Iraqi Americans. They had gone, or their husbands had gone, to visit Iraqi family members in Baghdad, and discovered their family members living in Iraq were in an epidemic of diabetes. This has also been reported in Qatar and Kuwait, other Middle Eastern countries. And this one wife told me her husband was only in Baghdad for 3 weeks. He came back to the United States, and 2 months later he had diabetes. Well, I began to pursue that, and I informed Dr. Ernest Sternglass, who is on some of my programs and is a co-researcher with me. We're colleagues doing this radiation investigation together. And he began to look at Centers for Disease Control and other U.S. government data. He called me back a week later and he said, "Oh no," he said, "you're absolutely right. He said there are very large increases in diabetes in the Gulf states, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and he said that DU is being transported across the Atlantic Ocean in these sand and dust storms, and then because there's very high rainfall along the Gulf Coast, it's being rained out into the environment. And also, he said in Puerto Rico, Vieques Island is where the U.S. Military and British military practiced with DU munitions for decades. And he said, oh my goodness, Puerto Rico has the highest rate of diabetes in the United States. It's over 25%. That was just so alarming. And then we began to look at Alaska data, very, very high increases in diabetes since 1991. And there are no nuclear power plants and no radiation sources in Alaska that would cause such a huge increase of diabetes. And then I took Centers for Disease Control data for diabetes from 1980 through 2002. And the truth was in that data. Between 1980 and 1990, there was an increase of 1 million diagnosed diabetes cases in the United States. So the diabetes increased from a level of about 5.7 million diagnosed cases in 1980 to about 6.7 million cases 10 years later in 1990. However, from 1990 to 2002, the number of diagnosed diabetes cases increased over 7 million to more than 13 million. So in the decade 1980 to 1990, the increase was only 1 million, but in the next 12 years, 1990 to 2002, the increase was 7 million. That's a huge increase. And what was really alarming was between 1996 and 1997, there were 2 million new cases diagnosed in a single year. That's twice as much new cases of diabetes as during the whole decade from 1980 to 1990. And when I began looking at Japanese vital statistics, their public health data, I could see that same big jump between 1996 and 97. I looked at data for New York City. It was in that data, and so I knew it had to be a global environmental event. Now, with cancer, increases in cancer are horrendous in these contaminated regions, but also we have used more and more and more depleted uranium each year, and that big peak increase between 1996 and 97 was when the no-fly zone carpet bombing and grid bombing began in earnest, and of course this was under President Clinton. I think you could call him justifiably a major war criminal. Also, George Herbert Walker Bush and our President George W. Bush. All of these presidents have been responsible for the use of depleted uranium in very, very large amounts, and actually the official admission is much, much, much less than what they've actually used. Now, from official admissions, the atomicity equivalent, or the equal number of radioactive atoms in a gas, is the equivalent of blowing up 400,000 Nagasaki bombs in about 10 years. That is a horrendous global pollution problem. And indeed, by 2003, Iraq was so radioactive that our soldiers, 18 and 19 and 20 years old, sent over there, came back with cancer. And in a unit of 20 soldiers who served in the 2003 Iraq War, 16 months later, 8 of them had malignant cancers. The Centers for Disease Control issued a diabetes warning for children. And this is very interesting because it was June 15th, 2003. This is just after the end of the 2003 Iraq War. And the Centers for Disease Control announced that of all children born in the year 2000 in the United States, that over 30% would have diabetes at some time in their lives. And for blacks and Hispanics, they announced it would be over 50%. That is an astounding number. That is half of your population is going to have diabetes, have an illness at some time in their lives. Well, in 2 articles from Lancet magazine in 2004, November 2004, it's a medical journal, both of these articles state that it had to be an environmental trigger. So we know there are going to be large increases of diabetes, not just in the United States, because this stuff goes everywhere. No one can escape. It's in Australia. It's on the west coast of Tasmania. They're measuring it in the air. It's everywhere. And there's simply, there's no way to escape. These are some maps of diabetes. This is a global map of diabetes, and you can see that the most contaminated area, remember from atmospheric bomb testing in the United States, that happens to be the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And also the North Arctic, which is where the Russians did atmospheric testing and contaminated the whole Arctic, and the birds ate the contaminated vegetation and seeds and berries, and they carried it all over the Arctic and dropped it in their droppings. So they've really contaminated the Arctic very badly. Also, you can see where the Australia and the South Pacific bomb testing was carried by the jet stream around the planet and contaminated the tip of South America and the tip of Africa. Also in Pakistan, India, and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, the monsoons that travel from Australia up in this region across the coast of Southeast Asia transported the radiation to that region. Now, at the other half of the year, the monsoon carries it in the opposite direction from the Middle East across Southeast Asia towards Australia. And so this radiation is being carried back and forth and back and forth. And also the Chinese and the Russians, during their bomb testing in the Gobi Desert in Kazakhstan, did not want to contaminate their own cities. So they waited until the winds were carrying their radioactive fallout towards the Himalayas. And that is the only explanation for such high rates of diabetes in India and Pakistan and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. If you look at Africa, you can see the lowest diabetes rates are in Africa. So if it's an epidemic in the black community in the United States, it's not genetic. Blacks are not predisposed to diabetes. In fact, Dr. Ernest Sternglass and Dr. Jay Gould have discovered in looking at U.S. government data, we proved it now, that the most radioactive contaminated milk from dairies around nuclear power plants, such as 3 Mile Island and the Peach Bottom reactor in Pennsylvania, that's the first place they discovered it. The radioactive milk is being shipped directly into black inner city communities. And that is why blacks who come from Africa have the lowest infant mortality. They have very normal babies, very healthy babies. And so how can you explain why blacks in the United States have the highest infant mortality, the highest cancer rates, the highest breast cancer and prostate cancer rates? Why do their children have the highest asthma rates? It can only be explained by environmental causes, and radiation is the culprit. Here, if you look at New York City, you can see that Harlem, the Bronx, and Brooklyn have the highest rates of diabetes in New York City, and if you look at Manhattan and the affluent white areas, they have the lowest rates. They're all drinking the same water. Drinking water and dairy products are the two main pathways for radiation into the body. We found the same pattern in Washington, D.C. The highest rate for mortality from cancer is in the United States, and the black population is in Washington, D.C. And the lowest death rate or mortality rate for cancer in the white population is in Washington, D.C. We looked at San Francisco County by race. The highest infant mortality is in the black population, and when they turned the nuclear power plant off in Sacramento, Rancho Seco, which contaminated all the drinking water for the Bay Area because it was snowed out and rained out in the Sierras, infant mortality for Asians and whites went almost down to very, very low rates, but in the black population it stayed high, and it continued to go up when there were accidents and leaks at nuclear power plants, and it went down when the nuclear power plants were shut down. So it's very clear that nuclear power has replaced bomb testing fallout in the United States, but also that U.S. government policy is to pass on the most radioactive contaminated food and dairy products to black populations. This is genocide. It's a deliberate, hidden nuclear war against blacks and Hispanics in the United States. And in this map of the United States, you can see the highest rates of diabetes are in the Gulf Coast states. And this is where the sand and dust storms carry the radiation across the Atlantic, loaded with depleted uranium. It smacks into the states Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. It's rained out, and it's an environmental cause. There's no way getting around it. And you see the same thing on the Pacific coast of the United States of America. This is a map of Japan. This is total mortality. This is from 1899 through 2004. And what this map tells us is that this very low line, which you can see below the infectious disease mortality up until the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped on Japan, cancer is actually very low. Cancer increased slowly from the time of the A-bombs dropped in World War II on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it has continued to increase. So the bomb testing fallout caused malignant neoplasms, or cancer, to increase in Japan. You can also see that cerebrovascular and cardiovascular diseases also increased. When nuclear power plants came online, that was radiation in addition to the bomb testing fallout. So the rate increased more steeply, and then in 1991 you can see in this data very clearly that there is a very steep increase in mortality from cancer in Japan, and you can see the 1996-97, that big leap when the big heavy no-fly zone grid bombing and carpet bombing occurred in Iraq. In fact, we are all Gulf War veterans. In August of 2004, Terry Jemison of the Department of Veterans Affairs stated to Christopher Boland, a journalist at the American Free Press, that in the 14-year period since 1991, or 13-year period, Gulf-era soldiers who had served in the Gulf region, there were over 518,000 on medical disability. And in that same period, only 7,039 soldiers were wounded on the battlefield. This is a horrendous, very, very high rate. It's over 50% of the soldiers are ill. They're on medical disability. This is the highest rate in any history of any battles or wars in the United States. Terrell Arnold, who's been responsible for training our most senior and most promising military officers as chairman of the Department of International Studies at the U.S. National War College in Washington, D.C., reports that coalition dead and wounded may actually be twice what the U.S. government admits, and that including the effects of our use of depleted uranium and other toxic weapons, quote, a long-term casualty rate for American forces of 40 to 50% appears realistic. So if they're teaching that, if they're knowledgeable about that at the top war college in the United States, then the government is fully aware of what is happening, and so are the senior officers in the military. In fact, a military publication, one of their magazines, stated several years ago that only 270 American soldiers have been tested for depleted uranium exposure, and yet we have over 500,000 on medical disability. I took a bill from the Connecticut legislature, which the Speaker of the House authored. Her name is Pat Dillon. She's an epidemiologist from Yale, and she knew a sick soldier. So she wanted to do something to help them at the state level. And I took that bill to Louisiana in February of 2005. And I was completely astounded. I gave the bill to a Vietnam veteran at an anti-war rally in the French Quarter on the steps of the Louisiana Supreme Court building. 2 months later, the governor signed it into law, effective immediately. And we now have 18 states that have introduced or passed bills in their legislatures to treat and test the National Guardsmen. And the states can only pass this legislation for the National Guardsmen because they do not have legal jurisdiction over the regular military. Much to my astonishment, this pushed states' rights against federal rights, and it also made the regular military personnel angry because they were not getting the same treatment as the National Guardsmen. And so they began putting pressure on Congress and the Pentagon. And so we now have a dynamic that is opening the issue in the United States. And I hope that more and more states, and I'm sure they will pass this bill that puts more pressure on Congress. Also, Arcata in Northern California has introduced a bill. And so we want to thank legislators around the United States, citizens around the United States, and most of all the Vietnam veterans who have been the best supporters of these bills and really help facilitate them through the state legislatures. So you never know what will happen. You just have to try. Because if you don't try, nothing can happen.